Hello, everyone, and welcome to this amazing and informative talk with Phil Hood, brought to you by the Ucluelet and Area Historical Society. The Pacific Rim Arts Society is proud to have this as one of our events for our Cultural Heritage Festival this year. This year's focus is on the Thornton Creek Hatchery. So all these years I've been an artist, I've always had a fluid look to my artwork. So I could never really understand it, and I understood it far too late. When I was in my 40s that I realized, hey, I've been doing this work because of all the years I spent looking off my dad's stern on a fishing boat. So all those years influenced my work as an artist. Like many people in this room, this is a very personally significant matter. The Thornton Creek Hatchery has been part of many of our lives. There's lots of volunteers and workers that are in the room tonight, and it was of utmost importance to my family here in Ucluelet. My late Uncle Doug was a tireless advocate for both the commercial troll fleet and for salmon enhancement. Dougie volunteered for 35 years at the hatchery and was well known for doing pit projects and for doing KGB, which was the Komodo gravel bar. And although things like gravel were paid for, he didn't really make a lot of money do it. It was a labor of love for him throughout the years when he had time off from fishing. So, the only bad thing about it was it effectively destroyed his truck. But isn't that the way it is in places like this? With boards and volunteers, often the general public doesn't know how dedicated these individuals are and to their cause. So, and we well know it being with Praz. Kelly Deacon here, our executive director, she works so hard and nobody would ever really know. So, I can vouch for that. Richard Smith, for example, who cannot be here tonight, during his time at the hatchery, he was everything there. He was there every day and even after dinner. So thank you, Richard, for your service and for making salmon enhancement and the hatchery your passion and a true labor of love. I am also very honored to be in the presence of some individuals who have made a significant impact and contribution to not only the hatchery, but to the survival of the fishing for Ucluelet and coastal communities that depend on it. When I was a teenager, we knew that the trawler fleet was being decimated due to restrictions by DFO and political powers that be. And I remember today, heroes like Dan Edwards beside me, who did a hunger strike in Tofino to attempt to save our family's livelihood. I remember in those days I was just a teenager using my art skills to write posters for my grandmother and my uncle so that we could march those posters through some city streets. So, we were all in it and did what we could, and some did a lot more. Growing up here, fishing was my family's legacy. My family has been fishing these waters since the 1920s, so for 3 generations, maybe 4. My Uncle Doug was likely the last Japanese-Canadian trawler out of Ucluelet. And as such, a big part of my family and this coastal community's history. And I think it's important to recognize the impact and history of the Thornton Creek Hatchery so that people in the community understand not only what the organization does, but all of the individuals and families that have helped make it what it is today and those continuing this valuable work. So thank you very much for being here. I thank you from Praz for the Cultural Heritage Festival, and I now pass on to Phil.
Thank you very much, and I'd just take a second to introduce Dan Edwards. I've done a huge number of interviews, and the one name that came up over and over and over again is that Dan Edwards is kind of like a superhero. And I think that one of the things we're going to learn tonight is how hard Dan worked. I'm going to use the word celebration. It's a celebration of who we are as a community. It's a celebration of a group of people, a large group of people, and maybe many of you right here in this room, who rose to the occasion in a major crisis. And the success was the success of the community coming together. I need to paint a bigger picture of what it was like in the 1970s, the 1980s, and the 1990s in Ucluelet. Prior to 1970, Ucluelet was definitely known as a fishing community. And there were several factors that started to happen in the community that started to make dramatic change. One of them was the coming of Pacific Rim National Park. And believe me, if you were here in those days, that was a tremendous challenge to what was this little village. It was a very difficult time. The next thing that happened was in the 1970s, where the challenges, the fishing industry, overfishing, and the next thing, 1990s, were the challenges of the logging industry. Now you need to know that Ucluelet, the hard-working community that supplied the loggers, that supplied the fishermen, and so on, and suddenly the world turned against them, against us as a community. And so there was tremendous changes taking place. And you're probably saying, okay, what does that have to do with a little hatchery called Thornton Creek Hatchery? And I'm going to surprise you by saying, okay, we were confronted with issues of the transition into the park. We were confronted with issues of logging, the destruction that was happening in the forest. And so what does the hatchery have to do with? And I'm going to say, and I think these guys will agree with me, that the hatchery had everything to do with all of these areas. The hatchery became a focal point for a whole group of local people. Again, the fishermen, the guys the people who lived here, okay, the people who made their income in the forest, the people who made their income from the fisheries, the people who were on the school board and all of that kind of stuff. They had their families. At one point, there was like as many as 400 fish boats operating out of Ucluelet. Then there was all these world pressures, right, coming on us. There was the War of the Woods, and that was very much put Ucluelet on the wrong side. Then the Save Our Salmon, which really was highlighting the number of fish boats, and so the hatchery became a place for this community to come together and try to address those issues. Nobody had to convince them that there were issues with the streams and the logging. Even the loggers knew what was going on. So Thornton Creek gave them a place where it said, well, we can come together as a community and we can do this. They said, okay, well, we're fishermen. We benefit from this. We're going to get involved in this hatchery, and we're going to see if we can't address these issues that were changing who we were as a community. So Thornton Creek Hatchery, to this day, a critical place for the people of Ucluelet to roll up their sleeves and address some of these major issues that have confronted us for, 45 years. All the interviews I've done, I have tried to come up with a positive statement. This came out of an interview that I did with Paul, and we'll hear from Paul a little bit later. Salmon are like family to us, the connection that never should be broken. Hatcheries bring people together for the sake of salmon, and that's the only way we will overcome the chaos we're in now. So yeah, Thornton Creek Hatchery, since the mid-1970s, has become an important part of Ucluelet. The idea of community and family, and the idea of 3 generations in that picture right there of family. In Dan's case, multiple generations of fishermen, and they were all coming together to try to resolve this problem. So what were the big picture problems? The big picture initially would, of course, everybody focused on the overfishing. And you know what? It was a real issue. That issue in the, again, the 70s, earlier in the 50s, the 30s, the 20s, there were like 92 canneries on the British Columbia coast. Now, you have to show both sides of the story, and that is the overfishing concept. That's because there was a market for the fish. Okay, the world had just faced World War I and World War II, and the world needed a source of protein, and Canada was exporting to the world food that addressed the issue of starvation, basically in places like, well, all over Europe. Canadian fish, cod from the East Coast and salmon from the West Coast, were helping to address some significant issues. So after the war, it started to go down a little bit. But as we all know, an incredible amount of salmon were taken out of the sea at that time, just as there was an incredible amount of cod taken out of the sea before. So the next thing that was obvious, okay, the idea that the impact of logging and before 1990, it was pretty much fair game to do whatever was necessary to harvest the logs, including using the creeks, bring the logs to market and so on and so forth. There was no thought given to the fact that they were destroying the habitat of the fish. And it wasn't until the 1990s, when the Clayoquot War of the Woods came along, that suddenly the world became focused on this issue that was right here in our backyard. And so one of the first things that the hatchery did was they started to address the issues of the damage that was done through logging. So impact of logging was a major issue for the loss of the salmon. And then multinational offshore fishing of salmon. I'm sure these guys can particularly tell stories about how, well, there's the one story that's on the base of that. I don't know if you can read it, but at one time the Russian trawler fleet, there was like 37 ships out there, and they were taking all the salmon that were trying to run into Barkley Sound where they would have spawned. They literally scooped up the whole thing. There are stories of harassment that was taking place. It wasn't just the Russians, but the Japanese, the Americans, the Chinese, all of the Pacific Rim countries. They all wanted this rich resource that happened to be right on our doorstep. And so, yeah, multinational or offshore fishing was a big issue. And then, of course, there's the whole elephant in the room, and that's climate change. And so all of these factors have come together to really seriously deplete the salmon population, especially on the west coast of Vancouver Island, especially in Ucluelet. Hatcheries have been around a long time. And I think the first hatcheries in Canada were in the 1890s. And the Kennedy Lake Hatchery was quite a big deal back in the 1930s and 20s and 30s. And it fed a tremendous resource of salmon into the Clayoquot area through Kennedy River. And it was a very important fish estuary. The Kennedy Lake Hatchery was closed by the government in 1933. Now, it was due to the Depression. The government of Canada simply didn't have any money, and they said, okay, let's cut out hatcheries. And I don't think Kennedy Lake has ever recovered. So hatcheries have been around a long time. So, you know, it's interesting that this letter that I received from Mr. Edwards here, when I say I received, in the 1970s, I was the editor and owner of the little community newspaper here in Ucluelet. And for 10 years, we covered all of these issues in the newspaper. By the way, the newspapers, the back issues of the West Coaster and the Westerly are a tremendous archive of information. But anyway, as the editor, I received this letter from Mr. Dan Edwards, and he was confronting the fact that a hatchery on Thornton Creek, run by the Department of Fisheries, was about to be closed. And at this point, I'm going to say, Mr. Edwards, please take over that story. It's an amazing story.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. Can everybody hear me? Do I have to stand up? Yeah, all right, great, thanks, because I don't, getting too old this time for 20 minutes. Thanks for the kudos there. Well, about you know, being a superhero, when he said it, I thought, well, it must be Deadpool, because, you know, no matter how many losing battles he gets into, it just keeps coming up and starting again,
Hey, you're a
right?
community hero,
yeah,
man.
yeah. So when Phil first asked me to do this, I said, no, it's too painful. This is a too painful story. And so I wasn't going to do it. And I said, I don't do salmon anymore. I haven't done salmon for 20 years. But you know, like Deadpool, I said, okay, give it a shot. So here I am, and thanks for asking me, Phil, and thanks for the kind words and for the opening comments. So I have a kind of a speech here. I'm going to try and read from some of it. I will start though with that letter and with my first involvement with the hatchery. So in 1975-77, I worked in the woods as a surveyor for McMillan Bodell, and I started working at a fish camp after that for about 77, and I had the bright idea that maybe we could use the EI program to get people who were out of work in the wintertime, which was most fishermen, and they could work in the streams to repair a lot of the damaged streams that were damaged by logging practices in the area. And I had this idea. I went to DFO. They said, go to HRDC, which is Human Resources Development Canada. They look after EI. I go to HRDC. They said, no, don't do that. Go back to DFO. Went back and forth for 2 years, right? Nothing happened, right? But 1979, I get a call late at night. And it's late. It was about 9 o'clock where I was, but the guy phoned me from Ottawa from a phone booth, and he was a salmon enhancement official from DFO, and he said, you can't, here's my name, but you can't use it publicly, because if you do, I'll get fired. He said, they're going to bulldoze Thornton Creek. And he said, could you mobilize the community to try and save it? And I said, well, he said, I hear you're interested in salmon enhancement, so maybe you can do something there to help. And I said, yeah, I'll give it a shot. And I wrote a few letters, a letter that Phil did. He found in the paper, which it was a long time ago. I don't remember even writing that letter, but I did write a lot of letters, and a lot of people in the community came up and said, let's do that, let's do something. And what they did was that they started working with the MP and the MLA and with the different DFO people and all their connections they had, and they managed to get DFO to relent on the bulldozing of the hatchery. Now that hatchery was built as an experimental hatchery for chum salmon, or dog salmon, chum salmon, same thing. And it was done as a model of the Japanese hatcheries in Hokkaido, the northernmost island in the archipelago of Japan. And since 1870s, they've had private and public hatcheries that raise chum in that area. And today, if you Google it, everybody can Google all this stuff now. It's all there. 140 hatcheries. A lot of them run by the government. A lot of them run by private groups. Huge amount of employment in a very rural area. Lots of manufacturing. They bring the fish in and they cure it and they sell it, and it keeps a lot of communities alive. And that was what DFO was doing. They were trying to see if the hatchery here would work in the Pacific and BC the same as they did in Hokkaido. It worked great. It was a real success. They did 1.5 million chum. They had so many chum come back that they ended up having 2 gillnet fisheries for 2 falls. It comes in mid-fall, that run, and gillnet fisheries in the harbor. So then you have to ask yourself, well, why did they want to get rid of it? Well, there was 2 reasons for that we were told at the time. One was the manager in Port Alberni, there's a number of different branches in DFO, and one branch is the branch that looks after the criminals on the water, and which are mostly fishermen apparently, according to them. But they look after the enforcement, and so the enforcement branch, the manager of that said, we don't want to deal with a bunch of drunk fishermen in the water and we kill it. We've got to get rid of this thing. That was one statement. And the other one was simply that Canada decided that they only wanted, and this is, when I say Canada, it's the federal government of Canada runs the fishery in all of Canada on the 3 coasts. and it's a very distant management model. And they decided they only wanted 3 hatcheries on the West Coast. They wanted Canuma, and they wanted Robertson Creek, and they wanted Nitnat. And Nitnat was chum mostly and Chinook. The other hatchery was Robertson, which was coal and Chinook, and then Canuma was Chinook and coal as well. And they wanted nothing to do with these small hatcheries except for maybe a little bit sort of like almost like make-work projects in little areas of the coast. And so they did some of those, and some that were specifically, in fact, Thornton Creek, when the community got together and saved it, DFO said, okay, it's a community economic development hatchery. That's what they called it, a community economic development program hatchery. That was the framework they used. And we did it in partnership with Ucluelet First Nation and Tokor First Nation. They were on the board. They had permanent members on the board. The board itself was just a community board. Anybody could come in and be part of it. There was no exclusion of any kind. You just want, if you know, it's hard enough to kind of get people sometimes to sit on boards. But we never had any kind of problem with getting enough people, and anybody who was interested could be part of it. And they used that framework to, and there's 21 of those hatcheries, those CDB hatcheries, small hatcheries in communities around the coast. And they don't do a lot of production, and so they would refuse. When we first started the hatchery and formed the board, and I was asked by Mike White. I phoned Mike the other day. He was in Prince George. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here. But Mike was the first chair of that hatchery back, and he was from Tofino. And a guy named Pat Koreski, I think it was. Mm-hmm. And there was other people in this community. Rose Davison was one. Lowell Patton. These people had different skill sets to help get hold of government and help to lobby for the hatchery to be saved. And they said the only condition is we're not ever going to let you raise chum in that hatchery, but you can raise, and you can satellite local runs, which is what the hatchery has been doing for years. I guess still doing it, right? So they would take the stock out of the river that was at a very low amount of production usually. There's a number of rivers: Kuduas Creek, Coho, Kennedy River, Coho, Chinook out of Tokor. And then they also partnered with Tofino Enhancement and did the Bedwell and Ursus and Tranquil and Cyper, and they did all these other systems. And they would take, when the runs were really low, they would take the fish, they strip the eggs, they would raise them in the hatchery to a certain age, and then they would put them back into the water. And when you do that, you increase the survivability tremendously. And so that was the idea behind that. Even that program had some significant issues that people had to deal with. There was issues around coal being put in. If you didn't put them in at the right time, they could predate on the existing wild coal that were already in the stream, that kind of thing. But we did that, and the hatchery did that, and it still does it, Dave. That's what I'm correct. Now, the reason I'm asking is that I haven't had anything to do with salmon or with the politics of salmon for well over 20 years. I did a lot of work in the community around salmon. In 2003, I sold my trawler, and I went and got into groundfish for hook and line groundfish for halibut and black cod and rockfish, and then I became the executive director of the area crab fishery out of Prince Rupert for 10 years, and I retired 2 years ago, and that's what I'm still asking. I don't do this stuff anymore, but I did a lot of it, and so one of the things we did as we looked at this situation, why were they going to bulldoze this hatchery? Why did they shut down the hatchery in Clockwood Arm in Kennedy Lake? Well, it turns out that for the most part, the distant management strategies that are developed in this country don't have any or hardly any connection to the communities they impact. And when you live and grow up in a small community like this, and it becomes very apparent very quickly. And you hear a lot about, well, governments aren't responsive, and governments don't do this and don't do that, and there's basically a lot of bitching about that sort of situation, and there's a lot of polarization around those attitudes right now. But what we did, and Phil was right, the hatchery became a focal point for people working together. We didn't fight with the loggers about the state of the streams. We said, let's go in and try and fix some of the damage. We didn't, tell the fishermen, you got to stop fishing. Let's get more fish in the water. That was the focal point. And it was somewhat successful, although there was all kinds of missed opportunities. That's why it's so painful to me to look at this, because when 1995, when I was executive director of the West Coast Sustainability Association, which was a association of First Nations and non-First Nations communities out here, whose purpose was to build a better management system that would be responsive to this region. When in '95, I went up to Juneau, Alaska, and Juneau, Alaska has a hatchery that started the same time Thornton Creek did, and that hatchery was run by a guy named Lad McCauley. It was started by him, and Alaska had a different attitude than BC and the Southern 48. They had what they called cost recovery hatcheries. So instead of government having to use their money to, our money through them to fund the hatcheries, which they could cut off the spigot at any time, you set up a system where the fish coming back helped to pay for the operation of the hatchery. In Alaska, what they did is said, we'll allow that, you just can't interfere with the management. So we'll have trollers, we'll have gill netters, we'll have seiners, we'll have sports fishermen, we'll have all these things happening. If fish make it back, the fish that make it back, the hatchery can then use that fish to help pay for it. And so that's what Lad did in Juneau, Alaska. And I went up and talked to Lad, and I looked at the hatchery. Incredible hatchery. It's right in the middle of Juneau, in the middle of a city. 150 million chum he raised. And I looked, and that was in '95. And the sad part about it for me was that Lad said, he says, if I had started this in the early '90s, I couldn't have done it. Nobody would let me do this now. And the reason for it was because there was new ideas around things like too many fish in the ocean, genetic purity of different runs, and all kinds of things. He said, so I would never have been able to get off the ground if I was starting now. And I said, well, I'm trying to do it again here in BC and Ucluelet with the West Coast Sustainability in conjunction with Thornton Creek and Community Enhancement Society. And he says, you won't ever get anywhere, because these ideas have stopped the ideas of hatchery being any good for anything other than maybe polluting the waters with too many artificial fish, so-called, and destroying wild runs. And those kind of attitudes started to bubble up. And his comment to me, I thought, was pretty astute. He said, look at Dan, he said, there's all kinds of glaciers disappearing here right now in the Panhandle, and those 10 years ago there was no creeks there. Now there's all kinds of water running, and now my hatchery and the fish coming out of our hatchery, the dog salmon, are seeding those rivers, just like they did 14,000 years ago when the ice age started to recede in this country. So that was his answer, and the reason he's saying that is that a lot of these ideas around genetic pure and all that are not really sound from the point of view of evolution. And he said there's some recognition of the need to maintain some of this, but don't have to be very strict on it, because a lot of these fish, including chum for instance, do a lot of straying. So do sockeye, do all these kinds of fish. The other issue that came up as we were trying to do a chum run here in Ucluelet using that model, and we got all kinds of money in the late '90s to do this, because they were destroying the fishing industry, as we've mentioned here. They just wanted to get rid of it, and they did a good job. In fact, I saw Mike Smith just came in, and I'd like to welcome Mike. He's the last troller living here in Ucluelet. Thanks, Mike. Thanks for coming, Michael.
Yeah, thank you for coming.
Thanks for still being here. But that's a reality of what happened here. That's why this is so painful, this whole situation. Because if you look at what happened with, we tried to use the chum, and they said, no, we're not going to do it. We're not going to allow a chum run to come into this harbor. And we had it all planned out. There was people in the department, there was people in the management who said this is a good idea. We can do it. But the idea is that somehow or other you're going to get rid of, you're going to interfere with a chum run in Barkley Sound or somewhere. Well, the reality is that when they formed Thornton Creek, they did it on a dead river. There was no fish in Thornton Creek. It was a dead river, and they did it deliberately. They said, we can put fish in there, and we know those fish will stray. And so the fish that we were going to put into our fishery that we were trying to put together was a run that was already not even genetically pure of any kind. It was a mixture of fish from Nitnat and from Barkley Sound, and that was the reality of the genetics of chum, right? But it stopped the program. And the same thing with Kennedy Lake. When we tried to do the same program with Kennedy Lake, we couldn't do it. And the reason was the same kind of thing. There was people in the lake at that time that were doing studies on the genetic differences between 5 different areas in the lake. That's how much work was being done on the genetic side of this picture. The reality is that in 1910 to 1932, they released 8 million eggs from the hatchery into the lake. And that's what the genetic was. The genetics was that base, right? And so Phil mentioned whether, where is it at now, and maybe Dave could tell us about it, but when we tried to do it, the lake was already pretty much dead. But that hatchery allowed a fishery to occur in Clackett Sound until 1968, a fishery, a gillnet and seine fishery at the mouth of Kennedy River. When they shut the fishery down, or the hatchery down in 32, it lasted till 68. And so we wanted to, but the problem was with Kennedy Lake is that the small fish in the, what's the name of that fish?
Stickleback.
Stickleback took over the benthic feeding area, and you had to put a massive amount of sockeye fry. In other words, you had to put a hatchery in to overcome that. You didn't have to do it forever, but you had to kickstart it. But no, we're not going to do that. Not going to happen. So now you have stickleback in Kennedy Lake, and you don't have very many sockeye, and you probably won't have for a very, very long time. And in reality, now they've come up with a wild salmon policy, and it's things like, well, if you got a couple thousand sockeye in Kennedy Lake, I guess that's all right, because it's not dead, and it must be all right. That's what the wild salmon policy says. The reality is that you could have 250,000 sockeye coming back to that lake very easily, because that's what happens in Sprout and Sigourney Central when they fed those lakes with, they did all kinds of feeding of the protein into the lake. But you won't have it happen. So the missed opportunities in this area are pretty painful to look at. And the other issue is one of the panhandle and the issue of what fish do we catch here. And this is why we wanted to do Chinook and Coho here. This fishery, the troll fishery that they killed off here, catches 80%. Where am I at with the time here?
I have no idea, but carry on.
Yeah, do.
4 minutes.
4 minutes, thanks.
Go down, go.
The fish that we caught for years out here is 80% American bound. Most of them hatchery bound. Most of them are hatchery fish. And that's been a mixed stock fishery for years. And so we wanted to put in more fish in the water because the Alaskans are catching our fish, and we're catching the Southern American fish, and the U.S.-Canada treaty was put in place to be an equity treaty. We catch X amount of American fish, they catch X amount of Canadian fish in Alaska, we trade off and we try to be equitable. David Anderson in 1998, I think it was, stopped that. He got rid of the equity principle. And the reason he did is that Americans were catching way more fish than we were, and there was, Glenn Clark went to court and tried to stop him in a court case. The people in Ottawa are really mad about that because it hurt the relationship between Canada and the U.S., and they stomped all over Clark so badly that in 2001, he lost. They only had 2 seats left, I think, after that election. Mm-hmm. But one of the outcomes of that was the provincial government in 2001, the Gordon Campbell government got rid of the word fish out of all his cabinets. There was never a talk of fish ever again. Because fish is a contentious political issue to deal with, and they didn't want anything to do with it. And it wasn't until recently that it was brought back by the NDP government that even the idea of fish being something that we should care about in BC. So sort of the final part of the story, I think that I started doing those projects in 1997, 96, 98 to try and get Thornton Creek to be a partner with WCSA. We formed a management board because, as I started at the beginning, there's something wrong with the way our management's done. It's too distant. We need to bring it home. So we worked for 10 years in the 90s, me and Nelson Keela, a whole bunch of First Nations leadership and people in the community, Bill Irving and others, to form a management board that would be made up of the federal government, provincial government, First Nations, and stakeholders, and we would manage the fish in our region. And that was our major project through the 90s. Even though these other projects with the hatcheries, we couldn't get off the ground, Thornton Creek continued to do, Tofino enhancement continued to do its work, and Thornton Creek and Tofino worked very closely together on, because Tofino at the time had $8,000 budget, Thornton Creek had 130, 150, and they shared the wealth, that little bit of wealth that they had in order to keep Tofino alive. But the reality is that there was very little money for the amount of work they did. And Richard, I met Richard, talked to Richard the other day about it. He got one raise in the overall budget in 30 years. There was no real money coming into these hatcheries, right? So, when we formed a board that was built to manage the fish, manage the resources. The federal government, the First Nations governments, everybody agreed to it. We signed it off in 2001, and it lasted for 23 years. And it really, we really tried hard to make it work. And I talked to some of them 3 weeks ago, and they just disbanded it. They just got rid of it. And the reason for it being that the federal government refuses to let go of its power and control model that it uses here. So the idea that we had for in the 90s, we spent 10 years, was to bring our management home so we have more control over what fish that we could raise in our hatcheries, what fish we could catch. We wanted to try and stop them from killing off our fishermen, and we failed in that. We failed them in stopping our fishermen. We failed in getting really productive hatcheries the way we wanted them to be, like they were, and it could have been in Kennedy Lake, for instance. We could have had a really productive fishery that we have nothing in there. So that's a painful part of this. I think that Phil's right in that we as a community, we're very resilient around trying to maintain and work hard to try and keep going. It gets very difficult when you spend 10 years in the 90s building a management model that we need, and for 23 years we managed to keep it alive, and then I find out 3 weeks ago they just killed it off. That's a lot of work. And now where are we? You know, we're now having to start over at square one because we still have no real management model that's going to be responsive to this community. And the question I guess I have for everybody here is, how's that going to happen? Who's going to do it? The fishermen here in this community, are they going to do it? Right? Because there isn't any left, right? So that's kind of we have a consensus-based model, right? So it's going to be up to other people to do it. It's going to be up to the citizens here to say, okay, well actually, we should have a good base in this community. We should have fishermen, and we should have people working in the woods, and we should have manufacturing, and we should have tourism. We need all those things to be a balanced community, and we need fish in the water. And we need to be in control of those fish that are beside our community, and we need to be able to bring them into our community and be able to either eat them or manufacture them and send them off to other parts of the world where they would love to have fresh fish. So that's over 4 minutes.
That's all good.
I'm happy to say that Jeff recorded that, and I think we all needed to hear that, and I think that we need to publicize this a lot more so people know the story that took place in that era. And so the next speaker, the community itself was politically very active at that time as well. So there was a very supportive community that was going on in a whole big circle. And one of those people was, at the time, our mayor, Bill Irving. And in that picture, there's Dave Christensen, and I'm not sure, maybe some of the rest of you can recognize it. It's some kind of a minister from Ottawa. But the people of Ucluelet, the political leaders of Ucluelet, came together in order to fight what was going on behalf of Thornton Creek Hatchery. And this is an 11-minute video, and it is definitely worth listening to. Hang on a second.
Hi, my name is Bill Irving. I'm formerly the mayor and council member in Ucluelet for 25 years or more. And Ucluelet at the time was a very prominent fishing community, very prominent, important presence on the west coast of Vancouver Island. And a lot of it was around the salmon fisheries. The fish were an essential part of the community. not only ecologically but economically, and also a sense of identity for the community, the marine community, which is, I think, a wonderful legacy. My involvement became in the response to DFO's actions in downsizing the fishing fleet. And it became very, very apparent that the decline of the fisheries, the salmon runs particularly, was one of the catalysts for the DFO deciding that they had to buy back or extinguish licenses. So it became a very complex process because there's always been a battle between whether hatcheries are the right way to support the fisheries or whether just rehabilitating and restoring the wild salmon without hatcheries was the right way to go. Haig Brown or Larkin, all those reports that came in about salmon argued against excessive commercial fisheries, but in the end supported hatcheries. So Ucluelet ended up being one of the first model hatcheries on the West Coast, run by DFO until they got sick of it after a few years. And then it turned it over to a society that they funded. But the goal was still the same. This is just to both rebuild the stock for commercial fisheries, but also to rebuild the habitats. And the more and more the community became involved, the more prominent the restoration of habitat became important. So my involvement became sort of the voice of the community because at its very core, we're so dynamically related to the resources around it. Fishing, forestry, the wild nature that tourists so much enjoy. The community does an awful lot to preserve that and keep it in balance so that the community has some stability and purpose. The cool thing about the fishing fleet, it was originally a lot of small boats, 2-3-man crews, but all family people in Ucluelet. So they were not only commercial fishermen, but they also were on the school boards, parent-teacher associations, the softball leagues, the fire departments, etc. That is fundamental to a good, solid, healthy community. People caring for each other and working cooperatively with each other. So as a mayor and as just a person who sensed that's the right thing to do for communities, that we took our battle to the streets. We went back to Ottawa and spoke with Mr. Mifflin about his Mifflin plan to reduce the fleet. And the poor chap, and I don't know if he's still alive now, but I think he was very sympathetic, but his bureaucracy was not. The intent was, and this is to simplify a very complex issue, but to reduce the hundreds of little small boats which they had to manage into just a few boats, which were easier for management purposes. So we opposed that significantly, but in the discussions it became pretty clear that the hatchery process, for all the pros and cons, was being intentionally undermined. And the government just had the opportunity to say, as times change, both in the freshwater environment where the fish are hatched and reared until they return to the sea, and in the ocean, there are significant problems. You can't fix the hatching process without fixing some of the bigger problems of the ocean, which is global warming, the massive fisheries from off the coast casting bycatch and the significant reduction in the overfishing of the herring, which is part of the feed for the fish. You can't not balance those two initiatives, and the government just did not seem to have the capacity to understand that we have both the natural or local knowledge on how to do that, and also the scientific knowledge on how to do that. They weren't willing to put that together. And that would have been a huge bonus. It would have, instead of the hatcheries becoming sort of a liability, you raise 100,000 fish and only 10,000 survive. So the cost to raise those 10,000 fish is significant. But if you brought your science and your local knowledge into sort of focus on solving the problems, I think you could find that the survival rate of those fish would be significantly increased and the cost would. But the other side of that coin isn't just economics and numbers, it returns the fish to the local areas where they can be part of the community again and reestablish that sense of community. So my encouragement, I guess, to the government was during that process to reconsider the whole focus of the hatcheries. And I know the hatchery people were also lobbying the same thing. They could do lots more than what they're doing to make it work. They had the same, they lived in the hatchery staff lived in the communities, Port Alberni, Tofino, Ucluelet, First Nations, and they knew the impact it had on the community, so they were quite willing to do a lot of very interesting things to sort of resolve some of these problems or bring it into sort of a practical balance. But the government just, for different reasons, they changed from conservative to liberal to minority governments, and they lose focus on what the long-term benefit is of bringing these hatcheries up to the 22nd century now, in both support of the fisheries and of the communities. So as local politicians, the community members, we felt it's pretty important to talk to the people in power making the decisions face to face, and to try to see if they could understand the impact of their decisions having on communities. And so we were able on several occasions to go to Ottawa with different contingents. The first one was a trip with commercial fishermen, regional district representatives, and West Coast First Nations. We went to Ottawa, made our case before the Minister of Fisheries, and a sort of odd story, we ended up there unannounced. We just showed up in Ottawa. And we were wandering the halls of the Parliament, and somehow a news crew found out that these lonely folks from the West Coast were wandering the halls looking for somebody to talk to about fisheries. And the minister himself showed up and hosted the meeting and said, I was called back from my holiday for this meeting. So thank you to the power of the press for putting that together. But he was quite a sincere individual. So we were fortunate to meet him face to face and got quite a good response. And unfortunately, the Pacific director for DFO had quite a different view because he had a policy already underway and our interests weren't very important. So that was a struggle, and we weren't successful other than to make our point. The next time we went back was with a similar group of local politicians, regional district representatives, and we were able to speak to the Fisheries Committee of the federal government. And I remember Elijah Harper was on that committee, and it was quite a privilege to get him to sign an autograph for us, because I think he was the same kind of a person, recognizing how these decisions impact communities and how important it was for the politicians to hear directly from the people, which is pretty rare. It's significantly managed so that they only get the kind of feedback that doesn't upset the process. So we were able to go back and lobby that issue as well. We returned a couple other times to on fisheries issues. One was with a large group from the commercial fisheries sector, etc., to speak to investment in Ucluelet as a fisheries port, to try to retain some of those jobs that were lost from the salmon fleet into the hake fleet. So that was actually quite a successful trip. We managed to get government support for the processing plants to stay in Ucluelet. So First Nations and other folks who were in fisheries had fisheries jobs to go to still. That ended up with a multi-million-dollar contribution from the feds to put in water sewer plant in Ucluelet. And I think the final trip was a group of local politicians and First Nations who went back to Ottawa to see the Minister of Environment and to get a declaration on Clayoquot Sound as a UNESCO heritage site. And tied into that was the enormous fishing legacy of Clayoquot Sound. And being a UNESCO heritage site, you need to develop sort of policies that were consistent with the sort of rehabilitation. And tied into very closely that was the hatcheries and the call on the government to fund hatcheries properly with a proper mandate to not only restore the habitat but to deal with the survival rate of the fish as they go out in the ocean. You run into funny anomalies as you go through that process, and one of them was that the sea lions were never an issue on the West Coast until about 15 years ago. And now each one of them eats hundreds of pounds of fish each week. And there's no management policy for that. So I guess that's an example of the complexity of managing that. And if you don't have local people with a mandate and an understanding of those issues that can pass that on to the powers that be in the funding organizations, then you've dropped a whole link between reality and bureaucracy. It's fundamental, I think, in solving this problem. Yeah. So part of the reason I think the West Coast Sustainability Association was formed is at that time there was quite a forestry struggle going on. Clayoquot Battle of the Woods, the Clayoquot forced land decision was made, and tied into that and the recommendations that came out of the scientific panel was rehabilitation of fisheries. And so Ucluelet had the Long Beach Model Forest, in the offices down where the old newspaper used to be, and they also, at the same time, the West Coast Sustainability Association, mostly driven, I think, by Dan Edwards' efforts, was formed to take a broader look at sustainability on the West Coast, both in fishery and how it's linked to forest environment, forest activities, and the ocean environment as well, how to put all the pieces together. They did an awful lot of work on sort of stream mapping, new fisheries, revitalized programs. There was also an organization that, I forget the name of it now, that Len DeZama was the catalyst for, which did a lot of stream rehabilitation work at the same time. So there's a lot of good things happening in the community focused on bringing reviving the fish spawn return in the area and also the economic opportunities attached to the community. And I think the bottom line for most people, they were willing to put their time and effort because it meant stability to the community. It tied people back to the land, or to the sea, particularly, and they just that love of the outdoors.
Central West Coast Forest Society.
So how are you guys doing? I mean, you want to stand up for a second and kind of, we've got our next speaker after a few slides here is Paul Correa, and I'm really excited to have Paul here with us because, as Dan said, there was a tremendous amount of political stuff going on in the 90s, especially with the Glenn Clark and his government. And but anyway, I'm not introducing Paul now. I just want to say that those transition times, I got to stick to the script here. The transition times included this brand new concept of tourism and this brand new concept of the economics of a recreational fisheries. And one of the first major events to happen to Ucluelet was the Bob Wright was a substantially well-connected and wealthy individual in Victoria, Oak Bay Marina, and he was setting salmon fishing kind of things up for tourists all over the island, and he chose Ucluelet to bring in the Canadian Princess. So as you all know, for how many years did the Canadian Princess run little boats out? Now, he was a significant political mover, by the way, Bob Wright was, and so often there were conflicts between him and the concept of commercial fishing versus tourism fishers. But he was a significant mover in that transition period. In order to promote recreational fishing in the West Coast, he brought Prince Andrew came out and was quite a well-publicized fisheries expedition. There's been some talk of the Pacific Salmon Wars that it hasn't actually been said, but those were significant conflicts between Canada and the United States. Paul Correa grew up in Ucluelet. He worked for the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and he was the director of Aboriginal Fisheries in Ottawa. He also worked for the nonprofit Pacific Salmon Foundation and salmon programs that provide grants even to Thornton Creek Hatchery. And but during the 1990s, well, with the BC government, Glenn Clark's government, Paul was brought in to become the CEO of a Crown agency that was it was called Fisheries Renewal. So Paul became the CEO of Fisheries Renewal, and the mandate of Fisheries Renewal from the British Columbia government was focused on community-based fishing enterprises, including provincial hatcheries. And so I see Paul there. His father and his uncles were both fishermen out of Ucluelet, part of the troll fleet, part of the Japanese community. So he has a solid base in salmon. So hopefully Frank will pin him, and so he's got the full.
Thanks, Phil, and thanks to everybody for attending. I guess if I were to, maybe already Phil is given the theme, people need salmon and salmon need people, would be the theme of my remarks. I'm not sure what I can add further than Dan and what Bill have shared. I'll try. I mean, as I listen to both, there's so many stories that can be told, but maybe skip the stories and try to say something that's a little bit more structured. Hatcheries like Thornton Creek may not be the answer as a single topic, but as we've heard already tonight, with salmon, not one single solution exists. They happen to be a keystone species in our ecosystems and support something like 150 species. That's from my Pacific Salmon Foundation days. Including human beings and fishermen and communities. So we're a part of that ecosystem. Hatcheries are important, and I guess Phil shared that quote, especially the small ones. And there's a difference between, and Dan hinted at, production hatcheries and community-based hatcheries. The small ones are important because you get people to interact with salmon, and when you take away that interaction, then what's really lost is they just become another commodity to be sold, but a commodity to be forgotten. And the story of salmon, and we could spend some time, we've talked a little bit about the impacts of forestry, but people don't know how hydro development in this province have really impacted salmon. We're really proud to say that the Fraser River is the largest salmon river that's undammed, but that's not really true. Every major tributary on the Fraser, the Lillooet down to Stave, the Coquitlam, Alouette, all of the major tributaries are hydro-producing facilities. And at one time, from the folks I've talked to from DFO in my DFO days, the Fraser probably produced cumulative, all species, in big cycle years, probably 100 million salmon. This would be, 150 years ago. Maybe not so much in the off cycles of sockeye or pink. Well, we're obviously nowhere near. We used to crow about big years being 20 million sockeye returning. But just think about that and realize what we've lost, and a good chunk of that is from due to impacts from hydro developments. Anyways, let me also begin by thanking the Ucluelet First Nation, the Tok'wak, and other Nuu-chah-nulth First Nations. Again, they've been referenced and thanked for their participation in the Sustainability Association. But I remember a harbor tour with Bob and Violet Mundy, both gone now, but a couple of years ago we did a harbor tour together, and Bob, in explaining the place names around the harbor, very emphatically, mentioned the link between our world and the spirit world, so to speak, and how you cross over quite easily. He spoke of people crossing over quite easily, and how salmon and animals are very much brothers and sisters, and a part of his point was the journey together. And Thornton Creek might be the impetus for this gathering, but maybe my perspective will be a little bit broader. Well, as Phil said, it's salmon that brought my folks, my mom and dad's side of the family, both of them were in Ucluelet, dating back to around 1918, 1919, when folks from Steveston came out to the Ucluelet area. So our roots in terms of what brought immigrant people from Japan to the West Coast to fish for salmon certainly is in my family, as there are in Katsumi's family, as he led off with. And a good marker, an indicator of what was so important to our families is that they were all sent east of the Rockies, those that weren't exiled to Japan. But I know when, in 1949, when they were released from the camps and the sugar beet farms and the mushroom farms where my parents were outside Toronto, they came back. In fact, I think along with Tommy Kimoto, one of the first back was my uncle Jim Nitsui, who would have been back in 1949. So there is certainly a family connection to salmon fishing and fishing alongside of folks like Dan's grandfather and father. But I have to say that, sure, I tread sometimes on my roots coming from Ucluelet, but I really can't claim to be a fisherman. Yeah, I fished with my dad, I fished a few trips with other people, but by my late teens, I did a few trips in my early 20s, but my late teens, I was gone. I'd become a city person. I was pursuing academics. I ended up going to university in Massachusetts. A whole new world opened up for me, but I can say that Ucluelet never left me. And so while I have done other things, I've never really left the community. But again, I have to be careful. I realize I haven't lived there in a long time. I part-time live there. I'm back and forth. But I guess the key point is I'm not really qualified to speak as a salmon fisherman. And perhaps I'm not qualified to speak as a Ucluelet person. Having said that, those attributes, what the folks put in me and your people and all the people in Ucluelet put in me, I don't think they've left me. And so whatever role I've been in as a government official, both with DFO or with the Department of Indian Affairs in Ottawa, or as an academic teaching at Ottawa U or at Simon Fraser or UNBC, I think I've spoken and reflected some of the values that you've helped put in me. And so I think the stories we can get into, I'd like to think I've tried to represent the interests of the coast. At times there have been challenges, and I think Dan and I can talk about some of those. I spent a lot of time working in the ministries responsible for Indigenous and Aboriginal affairs, and more recently in my work life, I've spent a lot of time working directly for First Nations, and there are some real differences of opinion. I think in the outcome there isn't. People like to fish, First Nation people are fishing people, but in terms of how to get there, there have been some differing perspectives in terms of what the First Nations would say are rights and title. They want that recognized, and then how do you deliver on that? How do you work together with neighbors? I don't think any of the people that I've worked for or work for today want to drive out their neighbors. They rely upon neighbors, whether it's in Haida Gwaii or on the Central Coast or North Coast, they want to work together with fishing people, and we've helped to forge relationships with coastal communities across the board with the Fishermen's Union and other interests. Dan has said this before, and I'll just reiterate, salmon are really resilient. You give them any opportunity and they'll stray, and they'll find a way back. And I think that's important and maybe part of their downfall, because they are so resilient. We can do things like bad forestry practices or bad hydro developments, and they're still kicking around. They may not be in the numbers that we can say that they're robust, but they're around. And you think about some of it, and it's pretty amazing. The other thing is, and it's a given, is that people are pretty resilient. So a community like Ucluelet that's been kicked down and around, has lost out in salmon allocation and that, it's still around. Now, it may not be the fishing community it once was, and Bill Irving mentioned the hake plants, and it's kind of disappointing to be known as the hake capital and not the salmon capital, but so be it. And having spent more recently a lot of time in some of the historical roots of the Japanese-Canadian community there, there's a resilient community just in my research. I mentioned how people came back. I recently, in May, was in the home community where about 60% of the Japanese-Canadian population of Ucluelet came from, in Wakayama. And it's amazing. I've just written a piece about how BC Salmon built a Japanese community, not in Canada, but in Japan. And as I spent time in that community, and I have before, but not the length of time I had this time, you can see what was brought back from fishermen who returned, some to return permanently, others on various trips, like my grandfather. There's etchings on a rock wall outside of his home that are predominantly, they're not from Japan. I can't say that they're exactly West Coast, but locals pointed out to me that this isn't from here. Your grandfather made a lot of money, did well, such that he could commute. He could spend winters in Japan and then commute to Ucluelet pretty well every year. So that's how wealth-producing salmon was. So it was nice to spend time in Miomura and see that. Another reality or thought that we can consider is that through my 50-year work life, the pace of the decline of salmon has quickened. Now, I'm not saying I take the blame for that. We've mentioned some of the concerns of forest practices. I've mentioned hydro, but it's more complicated than that. And from my Salmon Foundation days, we used to have a campaign about trying to get people to be careful in how and what they wash their cars with in the urban area. And when I worked for the foundation, we get called out to East Burn Creek in Burnaby, and the local stream keepers would say, you know what, we just lost everything we worked for because some idiot is using bleach to clean his white walls on his tire up in the upper reaches of the watershed. And you'd go talk to the homeowners, and they're not bad people. They're not out to kill fish. And when you point out to them the problem, they're remorseful. But yeah, they killed a bunch of fish by using chlorine. We used to challenge something through a campaign called the First Flush Syndrome in urban Vancouver. And that's after the long dry summer when the first rains come, and heavy rains, not a drizzle, but stuff that gets the storm drains going. That's a real killer of fish. That first heavy rain of all of the toxic stuff on pavement and on parking lots that get put into the storm drains. And we tried to work with the regional districts, and people would say, well, what you're talking about is astronomical in terms of cost. And so there's the trade-off, the cost of doing some infrastructure work versus the cost of salmon. The other is on the Fraser. It takes us away from the west coast of Vancouver Island, but there are these old flap gates on the dikes, and they kill a lot of salmon. And we pointed out what the cost would be to convert some of those into more forgiving gates. And we got some of them changed. I think the work continues. But again, people would point out, Paul, it's only salmon. or you try to introduce cattlemen and farmers to protect salmon, where usually if they found any coho straying on their farms, they'd kill them. They would not want to have a salmon found on their stream and be declared habitat. And so when I talk about not simple solutions, but the need for linked solutions that include all of us, that's the challenge we face, and the challenge of places like Ucluelet, and that, you know, probably could be at UBCM right now, the municipalities meeting, and again, kicking up an information campaign to just notify people about what salmon has meant, what salmon can mean. Anyways, let me end with maybe one other just anecdote. There was the big Chilcotin slide recently. Well, a couple of years ago, there was the big bar slide in the Fraser Canyon. And I had done a lot of work with Premier Horgan when I worked at Fishery in OBC. And he was a ministerial assistant to Dan Miller and Glenn Clark and a few other people. And Horgan called and said, you know, we've got some effort going on to move fish around the slide, Paul, and we spent a lot of money. And you know, it'd be nice if someone like you, who have been influential in provincial circles, could say a few things about what we're doing. And I said, you know, Premier, do you really want me to say something? And if I do, I don't want to be hindered in that. And he said, of course, speak your mind. Of course, you know, that's what we're inviting you for. And so I remember at a press conference after it, anyways, I got a call from, not from him, but one of his people, and they weren't very happy with what I said. I thank the government for the millions between the federal government and provincial government and the efforts to put all kinds of means into moving fish around the slide at Big Bar, from mechanical chutes to airlock chutes and everything else. But my point was, nature has a way of dealing with this, and part of it is what we call surplus, meaning having fish in abundance, such that when catastrophes occur, natural catastrophes occur, fish can cope with it. But if you're modeling and you're fishing, whether it's for catch fishing or for impacts from other sources, you grind the fish to where the economic line is really tight. Then when catastrophes occur, that surplus isn't there. So I think I said it in a little bit more diplomatic way, but it came out sounding negative to the Premier's office, where they wanted a pat on the back for the hundreds of millions of dollars spent. I think my point in all of this is that salmon do need a rest. And I know throughout my time in various governments and the not-for-profit sector, we've wrestled with this concept of, it's a Christian concept of Jubilee, giving nature a rest. And I know in fishing circles and First Nation circles, there's been pretty good support for that at times, but governments have been resistant because there's too much money at stake. And usually it's the bigger industrial players that will not go for that. And today, it's not a situation where commercial salmon fisheries have any impact. They don't. There aren't any. Dan has mentioned he's been out of it for 20 years. He's a good fisherman, so he's not catching them anymore. There are other players and other impacts that are happening. Climate change has been mentioned, and all kinds of concerns about warm water, lack of water, and there are bigger issues. And we need to build back a little bit of resilience in those fish. And they're capable of it if we give them a chance. They're already straying up into the Arctic, the Mackenzie Delta, and no doubt that they're going to find a way to survive. And we just need a way to have communities survive along with them. So, Phil, let me stop there.
Hey, thank you very much, Paul. Wow. Lots of challenges. Hey, look at that. Look at that smiling face. I think it's a great picture of you, Mike. You know, the reason I chose to put Mike's picture up was one of the multiple interviews I had the privilege of doing was sitting in their living room, and they started to tell all these stories, these amazing stories of the Thornton Creek Hatchery, and the challenges that they had. I'm hoping, you know, I wasn't really sure whether Mike would be here, and I know he doesn't want to speak. So what I want to suggest is some of you know those stories too, and so maybe now is the time that we can kind of throw this out. Now, some of the stories that I heard were stories about you know, storming the offices of the Tofino DFO, and as Jan put it, the boys had a sleepover. Anybody have anything to add to that story?
Well, Mike and I did it. I think it was like 5 days, wasn't it, Mike?
At least.
At least 5 days, yeah.
And what was it you were trying to achieve when you did
Oh,
that?
there was a huge protest against the Mifflin plan. So the Mifflin plan, Bill mentioned this, was a way that the government used to downsize the small boat fleet. So they took the licenses. We had one license for small boats. You could fish trolling and gill netting, and you could move anywhere on the coast. And what the government did was they split it into 3 licenses and 3 different types of gear. And what it meant, for example, is that I used to gill net, and we used to gill net and knit net, and people on the West Coast used to gill net. It meant that it cost you, say, $70,000 to buy a license. More than that, some $100,000. It meant that if you wanted to do the same privilege you had the year before, after they put the Mifflin plan in, you had to spend $300,000. You had to buy 2 more licenses. So, and you didn't have the privilege anymore. They took the privilege away. And the reason they did that was to downsize the fleet. And so it took, the Mifflin plan took the overall amount of people working in the fishing industry in BC from 16,000 to 5,000 people almost overnight. That's what it did. And so, Mike, we were working to try, and we had a huge protest. There was all kinds of offices got you know, we basically broke into them, and we sat down and we weren't leaving, and that's what we did for 5 or 6 days. And we talked to the manager, the guy who was the head of enforcement, and he said, "I'm ashamed that I work for DFO right now because of what they're doing to these communities. They're deliberately destroying them. They're deliberately getting rid of the small boat fleet for no good reason other than it's efficient for the bureaucracy." So that was the kind of thing that
So
led to
part of
that.
the story suggested that it happened over Mother's Day, and that you guys somehow put up some sort of a banner that said Happy Mother's Day, and all your mothers came, or your mothers came. But something else that came out of those stories was the amount of support they got from the community, the amount of food that was brought to them. Somebody else tell this story? Mike, you're not going to tell, are you?
We actually got too much food.
Too much food.
Peter White's family, he was part of the protest. You know, he helped us take over the office, and he had to tell his family to stop bringing food.
Some of the other stories. Now, I'll just quickly bring up my thing here, okay. I wanted to throw these names out here. Now, I want you to know that we talked to a lot of people in order to pull this together, but there were also quite a few people that we didn't have an opportunity to talk to, and something I want to throw out again to you, because really this is your story. I mean, I recognize in this room some of these people are sitting right here, but these are kind of important players that were active in the community at that time. Hey, can you tell me some more names? I'd love to put some more names on this list, and tell me some kinds of the interaction that you've had with the Thornton Creek Hatchery over the years. So I don't know how shy Steve Bird is, but
Yeah, relatively.
yeah, I get that. I know that Steve had been a long-time employee of Thornton Creek Hatchery, and you know, one of the things that, like Steve and Mike and others that I know worked there, what an incredible physical job this was, or is. I'm sure it still is. I look at some of the pictures, and I look at you know, these poles with a net that's 20 feet out, and they're standing precariously on a little bridge, and they're trying to dip like a 70-pound salmon. Like, good grief, how strong were you guys to do that?
It was incredibly physical, difficult to keep up with Mike Smith and Richard Smith.
Yeah.
Because, yeah, I mean, they were pretty tough to keep up to in the bush. And they were older than me too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, just looking at the pictures, then the concept that they're swimming the streams to count fish, like, man, that's got to be a tough job.
Keeps you in shape, yeah.
Yeah.
I always say, which muscle do you think we use the most?
Yeah. Some of these names, I think Paul might appreciate this name, Dr. Evelyn Pinkerton, a marine anthropologist who is sort of an expert on the role that the communities play in the management of renewable resources. And I don't know if Paul's still on, but Paul, I know you talked quite extensively about this connection between communities and the salmon. You certainly touched on it, but I understand Dr. Pinkerton was a bit of an example for you,
Yeah, I think Dan would know too. I think perhaps Dan's daughter was involved in academic studies with Evelyn, but certainly I think Andrew Day, who was executive director of RAMS, and that was, I think Evelyn was his principal dissertation advisor. Evelyn was involved in a network of community-based academics from UVic over to Memorial in Newfoundland, and there was quite a collective of academics on the community-based side, and Evelyn was certainly a part of them and spent some time in Ucluelet and other coastal communities.
Yeah.
Yeah, my daughter's in the audience, and Evelyn helped her with her PhD thesis, and Evelyn was very instrumental in doing some of the initial work around building the we call the West Coast Aquatic Management Board, which was the board that we formed in 2001 that was done under the direction of the Oceans Act and the interim measures legislation around the First Nations treaty. So she had a huge influence on me during the 90s, and of course with my daughter, and Paul said it as well with him. She did a lot of work on the governance side of communities. So the idea that communities have to be an integral part of the direction that's been given to how we try to direct our future, and that was what the board was set up to do. And another fellow was Craig Darling, who was the person who helped to he mediated that discussion. And we had 2 years of negotiations with First Nations, regional government, municipal governments, and the federal government to build that board. And Craig was the facilitator who helped bring all that together. Huge amount of work's been done in BC since the war in the woods on how to build better frameworks for dealing with resource management in communities, how to integrate communities into that management. Sadly, it's still we still have a huge uphill battle on that front, because governments still don't. Central governments have a real problem dealing with inclusion of communities.
I think I've had other copies of this. Julie Edwards was the very first manager at Thornton Creek, and obviously your sister. And again, I don't know, maybe she's in the room, I don't know.
No, he's not.
But anyone care to say anything about the efforts of Julie Edwards in the early days? And another name that came up quite often, and this is a Department of Fisheries representative, and that was Barry Cortezito. And interestingly enough, he was trying to get online, and for some reason there were 3 people that were hoping to come online. One was Doug Palfrey from Tofino Enhancement Society, Barry Cortezito, and a third person from the DFO. We're trying to participate, but sadly, but I understand Barry was quite sympathetic to the happenings on the Thornton Creek.
Well, he was an advisor to the CDP hatcheries for years out of Nanaimo, and it wasn't just Thornton Creek that he looked after. It was a number of other CDP hatcheries, but he spent years doing that job and sort of being a connector between the Salmon Enhancement Program and the hatchery. I mean, I don't know if you've run into him at all, Dave?
Just when I started, yeah.
Yeah, because he retired around that time, eh?
Mhm.
Yeah, so. Yeah, an interesting story about Barry. He lost his voice at one time, and I was talking, and he had a hard time speaking, and I told him about botulism. It was at one meeting we were at, and he said, "I've been using botulism treatment to cure that," and he came back about a month later and said, "Yeah, that worked great."
Cool.
So it worked well for him, but it was just a chance encounter. But and I often wondered if he lost his voice because it's a stressful job, and the stress of it was not.
I think another name that came up a lot now, and I really should have had this name at the very top of my list, and that's Richard Smith.
Mhm.
And I believe Richard Smith was like 30 years the manager at Thornton Creek Hatchery. And I understand he worked all the time. Mike and Jan said that, yeah, he was so dedicated to the job that he as much as lived at Thornton Creek. And anyone have anything to say about Richard Smith and his tremendous contribution to Thornton Creek? You're a quiet bunch. Well, you know, I think that names like Richard Smith. Now, we did make an effort to interview Richard, but there are some physical means that that just wasn't possible, and so I think that as an individual, he deserves a tremendous amount of respect for what he has done for Thornton Creek Hatchery over the years. So.
Yeah, in my notes, and what I'll give to you, I have a section where I honor the work that Richard did, because he did a huge amount of work. And as Mike would have said, I mean, the thing about hatcheries is you have to be careful all the time, especially when they've got eggs. All it takes is a power outage or something, and the next thing you know, you've lost all your work, right? So it's a pretty stressful job from that point of view, and Richard was always on it, right? Always awake to that possibility, and always ready to go down at a moment's notice and do the work. The work in. I went to see him. He's in the hospital right now. I don't know if he got out yet, Mike, because he's still in.
No, he's still in.
Still in, yeah. So he's had a very terrible disease that's robbed his body of function, but his mind is still very alert, and he can still talk, but it's pretty low. But he was telling me some stories about Thornton Creek and about the budgets they had to work with, and the kinds of struggles they had to make sure that they got enough help during the year and got enough grants from other sources to keep the operation viable. And we worked hard with Richard to try and put a hatchery, a chum hatchery into the harbor, and he raised chum for 5 years. But they refused to, like, we did experimenting around net cage holding in the harbor and that, but the department just didn't want it to happen, and at the end of the day it just didn't happen. And so he was very willing to try different things, but you know, he always had to deal with the sort of the oversight of the managing authority, which is an ongoing issue when it comes to these communities and what they can, what they want versus what the federal government wants. But Richard was great at doing. He struggled. He valiantly went through all that, and he just kept going for 30 years. So really important to keep that. I think Richard, made the hatchery survive even when there was years when, the government was just as soon just bulldoze it like they wanted to do in 1979.
I know people like the Harmsworth were on the board. I understand that you were on the board there for a long time.
Still are.
Still are? Oh,
Yes,
okay,
indeed.
so, awesome, so I'm sure you guys have some stories, but I know Al, you don't mind talking. No, okay. Not interested. Yeah. Well, I think that the point of bringing up all these names is that there are a lot of people within our community that are really community heroes and have done a tremendous amount for the community, for fish and so on. Bob and Vi Monday, that name came up, and of course Tokwat and other. They've been actively involved for like a long time. Doug Palfrey, again, I'm really sorry. He literally texted me 10 minutes before things started and said he was connecting in, but
There's a Doug on.
there is a Doug on. Oh, wow. See if we can connect with him. I don't know, Doug, can you hear me?
He's in the
Oh, there he is. I see him. Sure. Hey, Doug. You've got yourself muted, I think, so maybe that's intentional.
How's that?
Hey, that's awesome.
Okay.
Hey.
Okay.
There we go.
Just speaking about Richard Smith and all he's done for Thornton Creek Hatchery, he's also been a major player in Tofino Hatchery. When I started this work for DFO for 3 or 4 months every year, doing the salmon counts over a 3-year period. And we were counting less and less Chinook every year and some coho stocks. So a group of us in Tofino decided to start a hatchery and see if we could turn things around. And I didn't have any experience in taking eggs or doing anything with the hatchery. I had stock assessment experience. So I called Rich and kept questioning him all the time, all these different questions. And then he finally said, if you come to work for me, I'll go to work with you in Clackwood. And I think he probably said that because he was getting tired of all the phone calls day and night. And so immediately we started working on Cyper River Coho. And we graduated to Chinook. We built our second hatchery and enhanced Tranquil Chinook, Cyper Chinook, and Bedwell Chinook. And at the same time, Thornton Creek was doing, who I now work for, was doing Tokart Chinook, Upper Kennedy Coho, Maggie Lake Coho, and Salmon Creek Chunk. Again, without Richard and his support, we wouldn't be anywhere near where we are to this day. And we worked really closely together for just over 25 years. So when I think of Thornton Creek Hatchery, first person that comes to mind is Richie Smith. Next is Mike. He's worked there for longer than I have. Steve Bird, Gene Duck Manton, and the unstoppable Dougie Komodo. And that was the crew, that was the team. And we worked in both management areas. We started the whole snorkel survey program in Barkley and moved to Clackwood. And the snorkel survey project would have started in 1990 or 92 and is still continuing to this day. So, again, I can't say enough good things about what Richard has done for our small little hatchery in Tofino that is still getting its $8,000 a year from DFO. I think it's still getting its 150 or 160. So each of the hatcheries have had no budget increase really in 30-some years. So we've relied quite a bit on the Pacific Salmon Foundation, thanks to Paul and others, as they really have their finger on the pulse of the salmon programs. So again, thanks to you, Paul, and your cohorts in that. That's about all I can think of right now. Anybody has anything to add, please do.
So I understand you're partnered quite a bit with Howsett and some of the other First Nation tribes, and they're supportive of you.
Yes, we worked with the Talopians for 4 years, again, which paid my wage to go out there and do the egg takes and incubate up to 500,000 Chinook eggs at our little hatchery in Tofino. And with the Howsett band, they have a small hatchery in a box capable of doing about 80,000 eggs. And in the last 2 years, we've assisted them in their broodstock collection, egg takes, and their various releases. So yeah, we work pretty closely with those boys, and are in the process of planning our chum enhancement on the bedwell this year. So I'm quite looking forward to that.
Anybody else have questions that they'd like to, or just some statements about Tofino Hatchery or the relationship that existed or exists?
I just want to say, Doug, that your doppelganger's on the wall over here. It's George Fraser. He looks just like him.
You're right. You are right.
He's got the mustache. That's awesome.
Good observation. Yeah.
Phil, if I could give a shout out to the Pacific Salmon Foundation. It's a private, not-for-profit. It's grown a lot, but it's raised a lot of money for salmon work, and particularly community-based. And if I could tell I thought it was a funny story. I want to acknowledge my successor there was Dr. Brian Riddle. Brian, who was a salmon scientist for 30 some odd years in DFO, retired and then took up the reins. Really, I think, advanced the work, and then now a guy named Mike Manier, who's more a marketing type but has expanded the funding base, deserve a lot of credit. Anyways, during my time there, from my days in Ottawa, I had become friends with a lowly tax lawyer who rose to be the Deputy Prime Minister, John Manley. And I had worked with John, and when he was Deputy PM, he called me and said, "Hey, I'm wanting to come out to the West Coast. Can you help organize a fishing kind of vacation for me and my wife?" And so I did, and I took him to Skidegate. We fished out of Skidegate, through Skidegate Narrows to the west side of the Queen Charlotte's. Anyways, I took him into Queen Charlotte City there, and I said, "John, we got to buy some fishing licenses." And he said, "I'm the bloody Deputy PM. Can't you just pick some up?" And I said, "No, you got to go in, you got to sign them." And his wife, the same thing. So we're standing at the counter at this little fishing tackle shop. I've been lobbying DFO for some time. For all of you folks in the room, you know, when you go salmon fishing, you buy your license and then you buy a stamp. That salmon stamp entitles you to keep salmon. And back in my time, it was $6.42, GST included, and every penny of it went to Ottawa. And DFO would claim that the money went to salmon conservation, salmon hatchery work. And my pitch to DFO was that 100% of those funds should come directly to fish work. And guess what? The Pacific Salmon Foundation would administer it, would audit it, and show the government where it was going. And it would fund the community-based work that, you know, Thornton Creek and others do. Anyways, I got nowhere with DFO. So at the sporting goods counter, you know, the clerk there, young woman, says, didn't recognize Manley and said, "Who are you?" And he says, "John Manley." He says, "Got any ID?" And writes down, and then so in front, you know, in front of her, I say to her and to John, "Hey, where do you think the $6.42 goes to?" And she's chewing gum and writing his name out. She doesn't have an answer. She says, "I don't know. It just gets lost in Ottawa, I guess." And a guy who's the owner shouts out from the back, and he doesn't know who's at the counter. And you know, he swears and says, "It goes to F in Ottawa and the bureaucrats, you know, whatever." And so John looks at me and says, okay, Okay, you made your point, Paul. Wonderful couple of days fishing. They limit out. They get to see killer whales, whatever. And he sends a note from Ottawa and says, "You got it. It's in the budget. You're going to get your $6.42, and you guys can put it into community programs." So I went back east. I can't remember when, after budget day, no announcement, and I have lunch with him, and I said, "What happened?" And he said, "Well, Paul, you're going to have to talk to the Minister of Fisheries." I think it was Loyola Hearn was the minister's name. And there had been this horrible accident, the capsizing of, was it the Cap Rouge in the mouth of the Fraser? An aluminum seine boat had capsized and lives were lost. And at the last moment, the minister, who had been ordered by Manly to include this charge for the $6.42, I think I don't know what it was 500,000 or 600,000, whatever the number was. Hearn had pulled it at the last moment, and money went into search and rescue and whatever. And so I never got to deliver on that. But when Brian Riddle, my successor, was the CEO of Civic Salmon Foundation, the government did honor it. And so today, that salmon stamp money goes to the Salmon Foundation. It goes out to the communities like Thornton Creek and all the other hatcheries and that. So I thought that was kind of funny when Manley, who was the deputy PM, got that. The other thing, when we were in Skidegate, there was a big feast put on for him. And I remember this one kid running up, he didn't know who Manley was, didn't know who I was. And he says, guess what? Dennis Potvin was in town. He was brought by the regional director of Indian Affairs. And this other kid sneers and says, "We got the deputy prime minister and Paul Correa in town." Of course, they thought I was the hockey player.
Yeah,
So.
That's a good one.
Yeah, thanks. Hey, Doug, you did text and suggest that Barry Cordizito was online. Is he online?
Haven't seen him.
Okay. Again, I understand that that's Barry's an example of friends of the local hatcheries who are employed by DFO, and I think there were lots of them. I think from what I gathered from talking to Dan and others, Bill, that the guys on the ground here were more sympathetic than the people in Ottawa. So, and it just goes to show, like Paul's little illustration, how important it is to have relationships with people and let them experience what's here and understand the impact on the communities. You know, I'm not sure, but unless anybody else has anything to say, we've got one last speaker, and he's not the least. I asked him to bring his guitar and sing us a song, but Dave, maybe you can have the last word.
Okay, well, thanks. Yeah, thanks. It's been totally an awesome night for me as the new guy being at Thornton for the last 11 years to hear a lot of stories. I got a lot of stuff written, but I think given some of the stories I've heard, I'll try and just keep it a little lighter and not get too in depth. But when Phil asked me to just to talk about what's happening at Thornton today, so I think, well, is today history? Is it history? So I'm going, well, how far back do I reach? But Richard's name came up, and of course I'm going to bring Richard's name up because he was a mentor, and we try to carry on the same kind of work that Richard did for 30 years. We're enhancing 2 Chinook runs, 3 coho runs, and 3 chum runs. So we're still. And it was a seasoned crew, that crew for 30 years, seeing Mike, seeing Doug, seeing the man who cracks me up so much. So, same thing, hardworking crew. My kids have known since they were born that before they open the Christmas presents, I go to the hatchery to check on the eggs. You're absolutely right. Yeah, it is a hard job. And I always tell people I don't sleep for 9 months. So once we get fish in holding until the last fry's gone, we got hundreds of thousands of babies to worry about. So it is a tough job that way. when I sat down earlier, I said to Katsumi, who I've just met in the last week or so, I said, geez, it's weird to sit in this seat where the politicians sit. I always say I have too thin a skin to be a politician, but you know what? I am a politician in my job. I fight a lot. That's part of our job. And I'm sort of straying off my nose, but it really is part of our job. And I thought, you know, if I'm going to talk about the history, maybe I'll just stick with like the last little while. When I got the job, actually I'll change my topic. When I got the job, Thornton was on the chopping block. Lots of these hatcheries were on the chopping block. Another kinship we have, it's the same budget. It's the same budget for 35 years. You know, I mean, insurance is a killer. There's all these things we can't get a deal on. I mean, we still rely on volunteers and this amazing core crew that gives up their life for 9 months. I'm sort of year round, and sometimes in the summer as well, to maintain a hatchery, to go get the gear ready. We're making nets this year. Just everything about the job, and involving the community. And it's so important that volunteers are a huge part of it and inspire us, right? I mean, we're sort of the technical people, and we're trying to share that knowledge. I went to university, and I studied fisheries biology, but they never let you touch a fish. So a big part of our work now is actually training. It's a really important thing. If you had a doctor that never had a practicum, that wouldn't be a great doctor. And what I'm getting at is that now we're teaching people how to check fish for ripeness. There's no machine that does it. It's just like a doctor that squeezes your arm. We don't have MRIs. We don't have X-rays that we use. It's all a lot of feel. It's the fisherman's brain that we have that we get the vibes. It's like, okay, we got to check this river. They're starting to move. The big set of tides is coming. It's going to rain. Or it's like, it's really raining and we got to go make sure that the hatchery's okay. We've had logs, we've had trees come down. We're always planning for Murphy to show up. But yeah, and the other thing that sort of was slammed at me when I took over the role of the manager, and I don't know if a lot of people know about this, if you've been there, you know I am a Nazi about staying in the compound, because somebody got attacked just in the months before I took over the role. So, got attacked by a bear. And the CO came, shot it.
Mike and I helped carry it to the fellow's truck. But it brought a lot of attention on Thornton. It wasn't really great. And this was just one of those things that happened with the growth of tourism and the internet, that Thornton became a place to go to see bears. And that woman that was attacked, you know, there was a lot of bad behavior going on by people then, but you know, it precipitated a whole bunch of attention from the landowner, Island Timberlands at the time. They didn't want anybody coming down there. DFO was freaking out. The minister was calling my community advisor, our community advisor, and they were freaking out. The conservation service, obviously the conservation officer shot the bear. They were freaking out. So totally separate from the fight for salmon and trying to keep salmon alive is like another way, you know, it's not like the axe is going to fall for money. It's like, okay, now they want to shut us down because of this bear thing. And luckily that's when our amazing board of directors kicked into action and hired the perfect person, Bob Hansen, who is just still was at the hatchery today with the new Wild Safe BC year-round person came with him. But he came with me, we made a plan and we went to Island Timberlands. And actually I didn't let Bob speak, I spoke for 2 hours straight, I wouldn't let anybody talk. And finally they said, you can have your effing hatchery, and if anything happens, you're done. If anything happens again. So that's how I started my job, totally not fish related. So we had to kick in and become these leaders in managing bear hungry tourists. The cool thing was, is how did that benefit the hatchery? Well, it took a lot of work, and I think we, you know, I never say we won for sure, because another dingbat was just born 2 seconds ago. But what it did allow us is it allowed us to engage with these people who are coming just to see bears. We got to talk about salmon. So people were coming there totally oblivious to the role that salmon played almost, a lot of them. So it became a new sort of form of education for this greater public. And it led to another bunch of good attention to the hatchery, which led to fundraising. Because in my job, fundraising is a huge thing. You know, raising and enhancing fish is the number one goal. And we do, you know, like Doug you know, mentioned me on swimming, you know, stock assessment work. We do a lot of public education. We deal with schools. We do a lot of school groups. We do salmon in the classroom. Kids get the aquarium. They get 50 eggs. They get to raise them, watch them hatch, feed them, and let them go. The junior rangers, the Ucluelet Warrior Youth Group, really trying to engage the public. Because the other thing that sort of surprised me when I first got my job is the first sort of big conference I went to, I just turned 50. And a friend of mine, Jim Shikuski, was there from PSF. He said, geez, Hurwitz, look around. You're the kid. And that really struck me. I'm going, I'm the kid. I'm 50. I ain't a kid. And so that's when I started thinking about succession planning right away. I've been talking about it a lot. I hope I live. I hope I get to keep ticking. I love the work we do. It's really important work, and we do it with reverence, and we give her all we got. It's just as hard as it always was. We're not on the paved road. But it's really important to me to engage new and younger people to ensure that there's people to do this job and keep fighting for salmon into the future. I could talk a lot about salmon, and I don't think it's really the best time. But I'll say that, you know, a couple of things that are really cool that's happened with Thornton that show that we're winning. Because in this game, you don't always win. There are, as Paul was alluding to, it's death by 1,000 cuts for salmon. I was asked to address Parliament, and I actually did something that I got called a point of order to the Standing Committee on Salmon, because I had to remind Dick Beamish, you know, pretty smart fishing guy, that fish don't spawn in the smoker, the freezer, you know, sort of insinuating that fishing had no impact on stocks. Now, I love fishing and I want to see fishing continue, but come on. But we keep fighting at Thornton, and sometimes too quietly, according to our DFO advisor, but we're just working away. And a year and a half ago, DFO did inspections of all the hatcheries in BC and Yukon with contracted out special engineering company. And Thornton was, I'm happy to announce, this is the first public announcement I guess I've made, that we were chosen as one of the two hatcheries, one First Nations and one non, that was us, on Vancouver Island, for infrastructure upgrades. So we've been going all summer, our crew. And as Dan said, the hatchery was built as a 3-year experiment. It wasn't built to last this long. That was 1975. And what year is it? So you got water running inside a building and lots of water on the outside. You know, we've been doing lots of maintenance, but a lot of this stuff needed upgrades. And it was stuff that we can fundraise for, but it's expensive. We replaced several valves that the valves alone are $6,000 to get the machine operator in there. And we discovered a whole bunch of haywire plumbing this summer that actually was like so awesome to have a 4 and a 6-inch line blow up on 2 consecutive Friday mornings. But you know what? We found some cool, nasty things that would have killed fish if they'd happened on the wrong day. Luckily, the excavator found it by driving over it. But the cool thing is that the other part of my personal goal as a manager is to set it up for the future as a system, as an infrastructure, and with people. And in the end, it's people that are going to keep helping salmon through enhancement, but really putting it on the radar. And we try to tick all the boxes, as it were, with DFO, so that they can shut Thornton Creek down. And that's why we do education. Personally, I love education. And as an aside, I get asked this question a lot. If you could do one thing to save salmon, what would you do? Lots of people that know a lot about salmon. And that always grinds me because I go back to, well, it's a bunch of things. And some we can fix. We're always looking for bottlenecks to survival that we can fix. As Paul alluded to, how are we going to fix the ocean right now? But our DFO community advisors said, well, that's easy. I know the answer. I asked him a couple of months ago. I said, really? It's easy? He said, yeah, it's education. That's why I like it. The more people that know more about salmon and care about salmon, that means there's a chance there'll be people that care about it and carry that chain, just like the salmon of the chain. So, education, enhancement, stock assessment, research, partnering, societies. We're a society. And like I say, we're running on the same budget that Richard had 30 some years ago. So we're not in this job for the big hatchery bucks. And fundraising is really integral, and volunteerism is integral. And really, so it's partnering is what it's all about. You know, we have to work together with all the people that care about salmon. There's lots of different organizations, First Nations, that all care about salmon. It's not we do, you do, you do. And if we all work together, that's the only hope we have. So I guess I'm going to be a lot briefer than I planned on because the clock's telling me to. But I'm just saying I'm really excited to announce that Thornton will be going into the future. But I will also say, as Dan alluded to, they tried to cut back our Thornton Creek production again this summer. So as much as we want to do more, there's a bazillion scientific reasons why they want us to do less. They are not cutting our Thornton Creek production back anymore because we fought for it and we came up with a solution. Anyways, I think I'm going to just stay there. That I'm just so amazed by the diversity of the crowd that you come out and listen to the history. It's been a real treat for me. And if anybody's interested in volunteering, come to Thornton Creek Hatchery. Happy to have everybody. Anyways, thanks very much.
Well, I think we've had the last word. Thank you all. Sorry? Sure.
If everybody wanted to go home, I just have one final word. Sorry. I want to put a shout out to Bill Irving here at the end of this because Bill was supposed to be here from France, right?
Yeah.
His computer got lost at the Montreal airport, and so he couldn't go out on Zoom. So I just want to. I worked with Bill for years as a mayor and as a community guy. And Bill had a lot of integrity. He was very, very critical in maintaining every fight we got into. Bill was right there. So you talked about going to Ottawa. I went to Ottawa 3 times with Bill. But I wanted these stories about trying to battle against large corporate interests and large government interests from these small communities sometimes gets to be really, really nasty stuff. And so Bill never let that stop him. They never did. And so I got 2 stories about that I just want to share here to show you why I have so much respect for Bill. One is Bill was in his office as a mayor one time, and Bob Wright came in to see him. And Bob said, "Don't you dare go near Dan Edwards." They didn't like me, Bob, because I was very militant about trying to maintain some kind of balance between the sports fishing industry and the commercial industry. And he said, "If you go near him again," he says, "I'm going to make sure you never become mayor ever again." This is Bob, he's all my weight. And first thing Bill did was phone me up. Guess what happened? Not many mayors do that. He did. The next week, David Anderson had a big to-do in Victoria. Bill and Dave Christensen phoned me up and said, "Dan, come with us. We're going to go to Victoria." Go down to Victoria. Dave Anderson, who's there? Of course, Bob Wright, right? I'm standing right beside Bill and Dave. And Bob says to Bill, he says, "Yeah, I got your answer." The other story was about, you talk about infrastructure, Dave. West Coast Sustainability Association tried to use fisheries adjustment money. There was $200 million that was put aside to help with the destruction of the fishing industry. We didn't want that money to destroy it. We wanted to use that money to rebuild the industry, but they wanted to use it to destroy it. So we tried to use that money for different fisheries things. And what Anderson did is, we gave it to communities, and he said, we'll let you use this money for communities as long as it's got nothing to do with fisheries. And so there was like $17 million was spread around. So we have Tugwell Field, we have the ballpark, we have the Pacific Trail. That's because of you can thank the destroyed commercial troll fleet for that. Because that's where the money came from. And also the building at Thornton Creek. They let us put a building up and replace that building. That came from that fisheries adjustment money. And, that was a great thing to do. But, when I went on the hunger strike, and that was mentioned, the hunger strike, I did it because they were stopping the deputy minister had stopped the negotiations to build our board. The deputy minister sitting all over. Wayne Waters said, we're not going to do that. We got lots of kickback from big corporations, other people. We don't want to do it. And so he stopped it dead. And then the sockeye collapsed in '99. And we tried to get emergency relief for that because it was the only fishery that was left. Because they talk about resiliency, well, they've taken the resiliency out of the fleet. They said, okay, you're not allowed to fish Chinook and Cole anymore. You're not allowed to fish all these other fish, but you can fish Fraser's Sockeye because it's huge. It's collapsed in '99. So that's when I went on a hunger strike. After the hunger strike, we did $2 million. In '99, we did $2 million worth of projects in this community. And that's where all those different projects came. That's where the money came from. In November of that year, December, when I was on the hunger strike, HRDC, Human Resources Development Canada, stopped talking to us. And, when you do things like that, like hunger strikes, you goad the bear. And we goaded it bad. And what happened is they stopped talking to us. We had these $2 million, and we had to pay our wages to our workers, which we did. They didn't give us enough money to cover the taxes that we needed to withhold. And when they said, we'll give you another grant to do that, they didn't do it. They refused. And in January, they said, we're not going to do that. We're not going to give you the money. And the only thing, there's two things you can't declare bankruptcy on as an social society, something to know. Withholding taxes, you can't declare bankruptcy if you don't pay your taxes, and student loans. Those are the two things at that time that you couldn't. They sent two CRAs, people from the tax department into Ucluelet to all my directors, including Bill Irving and David Provincial, said, we're going to seize your houses and we're going to sell your house to pay for those taxes. It took 2 years for Dave Christensen and Bill Irving and myself negotiating behind the scenes. And finally, I went into the office in Nanaimo and I said, you owe us this much money, write me a check. And he said, well, I'll have to think about it. And I said, well, you better think about it real quick, because if you don't, I'm going to shut this office down. And the next day I went in and he gave us the money. 2 years. But it killed West Coast Sustainability Association. It killed all those projects. It killed all the ability of the community to use that money to keep going. So these fights that we have as communities, sometimes you really get into the trenches with them. And that's where a guy like Bill never stopped trying to win those fights for our community. And so I just want to thank him, because he can't do it himself because he's not here.
Yeah. Thank you. By the way, there's at least 5 other things on my list to talk about, but I won't. Wow. Thank you.
Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you so much.
I need better shoes. Maybe I need to invest in one of those mats that like the people at the till stand at.